What Mongol warriors did to capture Chinese princesses was worse than you imagine. In the winter of 1215, the Mongol army stood outside the gates of Zhongdu, what is today known as Beijing. Inside the city walls, the Chinese Jin Dynasty held their breath, knowing that if the walls fell, something far worse than death awaited the royal family. What the Mongol warriors did to the captured Chinese princesses in the aftermath of this siege was so horrifying, so systematically brutal, that Chinese historians spent centuries trying to erase it from the records. But recent archaeological discoveries and translated Mongol chronicles have revealed the disturbing truth. And I must warn you, but what you're about to learn will fundamentally change how you see the Mongol conquests. Because this wasn't just about warfare. This was about something far more calculated, far more personal, and far more cruel. To understand the depth of what occurred, we first need to understand who the Jin Dynasty princesses were. These weren't just political figures, they were living symbols of Chinese cultural superiority, educated in Confucian philosophy, trained in calligraphy and music, and raised to believe they represented the pinnacle of civilization. The Jin Dynasty viewed the Mongols as barbarians, uncivilized horse riders from the steppes who didn't even have written language. Chinese officials would literally laugh at Mongol diplomats in court. They would refuse to stand when Mongol messengers entered. They viewed them as less than human. This contempt, Dume would be repaid 1,000-fold. When Genghis Khan first sent diplomatic envoys to the Jin Dynasty in 1210, requesting trade agreements, the Jin Emperor Wang didn't just refuse. He had the Mongol ambassadors publicly humiliated, forced to kneel for hours in the palace courtyard, and then sent back with a message that the dog Khan should learn his place. 1 year later, Genghis Khan returned with 100,000 warriors, and this time, he wasn't interested in trade. The siege of Zhongdu lasted nearly 2 years. The Mongols had a strategy that was as psychological as it was military. They didn't just want to conquer the city, they wanted to break its spirit. First, they surrounded the city completely, cutting off all supply routes. Then they began a campaign of terror. Any Chinese soldier captured outside the walls was executed in view of the city, but not quickly. Mongol warriors would spend hours ensuring those inside could hear the screams. The Jin Dynasty had prepared for siege warfare. They had grain stores that could last 5 years. They had 150,000 soldiers. They had walls 40 feet high and 60 feet thick. They thought they were invincible. But the Mongols had something the Chinese couldn't anticipate. They had patience, and they had a plan specifically for the royal family. According to the secret history of the Mongols, a chronicle written shortly after these events, Genghis Khan gave explicit orders about what should happen to the Jin princesses when the city fell, and those orders were not about quick deaths. By 1214, the food had run out. People inside Zhongdu were eating leather, rats, and eventually, to each other. The Jin emperor fled the city in disguise, abandoning his family and his court. The walls fell on June 1215, and that's when the nightmare began for the royal women. What happened next wasn't random violence. It was orchestrated, systematic, and specifically designed to humiliate not just individuals, but an entire civilization. When Mongol warriors entered the inner palace, they found approximately 3,000 women of the royal household. This included the emperor's daughters, his concubines, his sisters, and the wives and daughters of high-ranking officials. The first thing the Mongols did was separate them by age and rank. The teenage princesses, numbering around 40, were taken to a specific chamber in the palace. According to a Chinese scholar named Wang, who survived the siege and documented these events in his diary of Dread, these young women were forced to watch as their mothers and aunts were. I'll spare you the explicit details, but they were violated in ways meant to destroy their dignity before their daughters' eyes. But that was just the beginning. The princesses themselves faced what Mongol warriors called the breaking. This was a specific practice the Mongols used on noble women from conquered civilizations, documented in multiple sources, including the Persian historian Rashid al-Din. The breaking had 4 stages, each designed to systematically destroy everything these women had been raised to value. Stage 1. The public humiliation. The princesses, who had lived their entire lives behind palace walls and were never seen by common men, were stripped of their silk robes and paraded naked through the streets of Zhongdu. Chinese citizens, starving and desperate, were forced to watch. Some accounts say this parade lasted for 3 days. Stage 2. The symbolic violation. The princesses were forced to serve Mongol warriors food and drink, while wearing only their undergarments. In Chinese culture, this was considered more shameful than death. These women had been trained that even showing their ankles was inappropriate. Now, they were serving as waitresses to the very men who killed their families. Stage 3. The concubine ceremony. Here's where it gets truly calculated. The Mongols didn't just violate these women, they forced them into marriage ceremonies. Mongol custom required formal marriage rituals, and they made the princesses participate in these ceremonies, speaking Mongol wedding vows, as if they were willing brides. The psychological torture was the point. They were making these symbols of Chinese superiority voluntarily participate in their own degradation. Stage 4. The distribution. The princesses were then distributed as wives to Mongol officers. But here's the cruelest part: they weren't given to high-ranking Mongols. Genghis Khan specifically ordered they be given to low-ranking warriors, and even to servants. The Princess Wang Yuying, who was 16 years old and had been betrothed to a Chinese prince, was given to a Mongol horse groom. A horse groom. The symbolism was deliberate. The highest of Chinese society now belonged to the lowest of Mongol society. But what happened to these princesses after the initial conquest is perhaps even more disturbing. Unlike other conquered noble women who were killed after being violated, the Jin princesses were kept alive for years, some for decades. Why? Because Genghis Khan had a specific purpose for them. He wanted to breed out the Jin dynasty bloodline. The princesses were forced to bear Mongol children, and those children were raised as Mongols, speaking Mongolian, worshipping Mongol gods, and fighting in Mongol armies. There's a documented case of Princess Wang Guifei, who was 14 when Zhongdu fell. She lived for 47 more years as the wife of a Mongol warrior. She had 9 children, all raised as Mongols. When she died in 1262, not a single one of her children spoke Chinese. The Jin dynasty bloodline, which had ruled northern China for over a century, was literally bred out of existence. But some princesses, according to the Yuan, the official history of the Mongol Yuan dynasty, at least 12 princesses chose suicide rather than submission. They would wait until their captors were asleep, then hang themselves, slit their wrists, or in one case, a princess named Wang Zena bit through her own tongue and choked on the blood. The Mongols considered this wasteful, so they implemented a specific countermeasure. The princesses were kept under constant watch, their hands were bound at night, and anything that could be used for suicide was removed from their quarters. Living became a punishment worse than death. The treatment of the Jin princesses sent shockwaves across Asia. When word reached other kingdoms about what happened, it fundamentally changed how Asian empires dealt with the Mongols. The Korean Goryeo dynasty, for example, immediately sent tribute and offered princesses as voluntary brides to Mongol nobles, hoping that cooperation would spare them the fate of the Jin women. The Vietnamese Trần dynasty created a specific policy. If the Mongols ever invaded, all royal women were to be executed by their own guards before capture. Death before dishonor became official policy. But perhaps the most lasting impact was cultural. For centuries after the Mongol conquests, Chinese families would tell their daughters stories about the Jin princesses as cautionary tales. The phrase, "Remember Zhongdu," became a way to warn women about the consequences of foreign invasion. Even today, Chinese historians struggle with how to teach this period. The treatment of the Jin princesses is so brutal, so systematic, that it challenges the narrative of the Mongols as mere conquerors. This was cultural genocide, executed through sexual violence. For centuries, much of this was considered historical exaggeration. Surely, scholars said, the accounts were inflated, dramatized, propaganda. Then, in 2011, Chinese archaeologists, excavating the ruins of the Jin dynasty palace in Beijing, made a disturbing discovery. In a sealed chamber beneath what was once the women's quarters, they found the remains of 37 young women, all between the ages of 14 and 22. DNA analysis confirmed they were related to the Jin royal family. But here's what made headlines. Forensic examination revealed that all 37 died around the same time, 1215, the year Zhongdu fell, and 31 of them showed signs of having been pregnant when they died. The chamber also contained something else, hundreds of small jade pieces. In Jin dynasty culture, royal women wore jade bracelets that would shatter if forcibly removed. Every single bracelet in that chamber was shattered. These weren't women who died in battle. These weren't casualties of siege warfare. These were women who died afterwards. And the physical evidence matched the historical accounts almost perfectly. Dr. Wang Xiaoming, the lead archaeologist, said in an interview, "We found evidence of what can only be described as systematic brutality. The skeletal trauma, the shattered jade, the DNA evidence of pregnancy. It all points to exactly what the historical texts described." Chinese authorities initially tried to suppress the findings. They didn't want to inflame ethnic tensions or acknowledge the brutality of this period. But the archaeological report leaked, and it confirmed what historians had long suspected. The accounts of what happened to the Jin princesses weren't exaggerations. If anything, they were understatements. So why did the Mongols do this? Why such specific, calculated cruelty? The answer is both simple and terrifying. It was strategic. Genghis Khan understood that conquering land meant nothing if the spirit of resistance remained. By destroying the Jin princesses, the living symbols of Chinese civilization, he was sending a message to every kingdom in Asia: your culture, your bloodlines, your very identity, all of it can be erased. This wasn't the rage of barbarians. This was the cold calculation of empire builders who understood that true conquest wasn't about taking territory, it was about breaking souls. The Jin Dynasty princesses were highly educated, culturally sophisticated, and believed they represented the peak of human civilization. In a matter of weeks, they were reduced to breeding stock for the very barbarians they had mocked. The lesson was clear. No amount of culture, sophistication, or walls can protect you if you underestimate your enemy. The Mongols didn't just defeat the Jin dynasty militarily. They erased them culturally, genetically, and psychologically. And the worst part? It worked. By the time Genghis Khan died in 1227, every kingdom from Korea to Hungary had heard what happened to the Jin princesses, and almost all of them surrendered without a fight. The systematic brutalization of 40 princesses in Zhongdu led to the conquest of the largest land empire in human history, not through military might alone, but through absolute terror. What the Mongols did to the captured Chinese princesses wasn't just worse than you imagined. It was worse than most of us can imagine. Because it wasn't just about violence. It was about the complete and total destruction of human dignity, carried out with the precision of a military campaign. That's the true horror of Zhongdu. Not just what was done, but how carefully it was planned. Resisted,